you can't hear me. I have unmuted it, so okay. Um, Sounds good. Great. Thank you, Kirsten. Welcome. Okay, good. The last time I did this last week, and the sound was really bad, and I discovered a couple things. One is that my phone cover covered over the microphone hole, and it was also facing away from me, and the camera was further away, so made it a little bit harder for people to hear me. And so the replay of the video, the sound was so low that um, I downloaded and uh, made a better version in Adobe Premiere. I upped the volume and I straightened out the images, so I had an enhanced version. But I'd like to just have one version. So this week I've played around with the camera angle so that it's straight on, or it looks like it's straight on actually to the board. It's a little bit to the side, but because there's some distortion of the lens, as it goes out to the side, the edges get a little bit wider. So that's counteracting some of the normal skew keystoning that you would have from the camera angle. So hopefully this is will be a little easier for people to see what I'm doing. And let me see, 6:59. We have 4 people, so just in a minute, let's reveal the white panel. Great. Okay. So I need a countdown clock or something like that. And let's give it a minute. So this photo is, I use the app Sketchy to find photos. Anyone who has an iPhone can use it. It's unfortunately it's not available for Android devices. Maybe they'll come up with an update at some point. But what it is essentially is it's a platform where people can upload their selfies, family pictures, etc., and then artists can come there, do a painting of it, and or do a drawing mostly, and then reload it to the app, and it pairs it with a picture, and people can comment on it a little bit like Instagram, where you can what they call it wow is like liking a picture, and you can leave comments. Um, and I actually started on this more intense portrait painting process using that app because I had much more resources to work with. So initially what I start doing to start a painting is I'll lay in some of the initial marks that I see here. I want to spend a little bit more time on the measuring drawing phase of this painting tonight because that will help it move a little faster. Let me fix this so that I can get to the top edge of the panel. And let's unfortunately change that a little bit. There we go. Okay. So I'm laying it in where I think it is, but inevitably the drawing is going to be off until start measuring it. But it's good to have just a little bit, some reference points to start off with. Actually, none of that is terribly bad. Usually I'm off by a good inch in some cases. The other side of that brow, and then the hairline is dropping straight down from here. I work site size. It's a technique where you have both your resource and your canvas, or in my case, a panel that's the same size. so that you can look back and forth between the two to see if it's off. Um, is also another way of going, which is relative size, but you still have to generally do some measuring to make sure that everything is right. And then you have to do kind of relative measuring, whereas like, let's say something is 2 eye widths across or 3 eye widths, then in that case, you would use the eye to measure, and then on your panel, you would look at the size of the eye, and you would use that to measure on your canvas. In this case, I can just measure directly and see where those landmarks are. So like right here, I'm measuring from the edge of the picture to the inside edge of the iris, and I see that I've gotten that right where it needs to be. I also want to check the height from the top of the panel. So I can, because it's site size, I can also um, just measure from the edges of the panel. Oh, so you see that the bottom edge of the eye is much lower. So I really need to draw this whole thing from side to side. It was right, and that's sort of where you have to be careful. You can't just, unfortunately, you can't just completely trust your drawing. Although if you draw enough, that does get a little, tends to be closer um, instinctively. But depending, since I don't really have her full face to work with, I don't have the top of her head, I don't have the other side of her face, then it makes it much harder for me to just instinctively locate where those are. So I have one video, I mentioned this in my last demo, that I went through the whole process where I had a painting that the measurements kept on being off, and I ended up working back and forth the placement of the eyes several times, and it took me 5 painting sessions, to actually do something that I generally do in 1 or 2 sessions. So since then, I've been a little bit more careful about my measurements. So again, I've instinctively put in where I think that where the lips are going to be, and then let me see. So I actually have the lips too high. Let's go in a little bit with a different color so I can see it. And then, so it must mean that I have the bottom of the nose in the wrong place too. So the bottom of the septum of the nose is right there. So yes, I did have it too high, so I can go in and correct that. It's not so bad to have to correct it at this stage. When you get a little bit further in, then it does get harder to change things, although I do it so often now that it's not such a big deal. If you watch some of my time lapses, you can see the eyes floating around all over the place. That's because I'm constantly adjusting where the features are in the face. Even when you measure really well, when you go into paint, just little subtle marks can change the position of something. That eye already looks too high. So relative to the other eye, her anatomical right eye, or the eye on the left side of the painting, is at a slant. It's a little bit lower, and so I just need to get it so that actually I'm connecting. Let me measure that too. From the tear duct to the edge, that's in the right place. And so then I have her other eye being much lower. And this is a little tricky because part of the full visible part of the eye opening is behind the nose. So it makes it a little trickier to measure. But see if I can get that. So that's in the right place, but again, the height is important. I actually have it, it looks like I have it too, um, I have it too high still. I need it to be down lower there. Okay. So I'm going to come in with a just a little bit of white to knock down some of those pre-painted lines. So Dave B asks, um, I'm trying to learn this. Should I be drawing more? So even though I don't, I'm not doing a under drawing per se. I'm just making, painting some of the landmarks that I'm going to be painting, sort of getting them located first. Uh, it, my ability to paint really comes from a long development of my drawing skills in I would say in a formal learning environment. So like I would say like 10,000 hours of drawing. And so I can I can usually tell pretty quickly by looking at someone's paintings whether they've had that kind of long um, long period of time of practicing drawing regularly to develop those drawing skills, because it does show up in the painting. So the answer is yes, draw as much as you can, as often as you can, if you can make it a regular practice. If you can find drawing workshops, usually that you can find open workshops where you can come in, but it wouldn't hurt to get some classes to begin with, so you have a some sort of framework to work within. I I trained. I went to art school at Art Center College of Design, and most of my foundation classes were drawing classes. And on top of that, I did seek out instruction from another professor at another instructor at his open studio, or his studio where he was teaching. So I was that on top of whatever homework assignments I had. I was probably drawing like 60 hours a week, um, close to a year, and then I continued practicing drawing through my full time at the school, drawing and painting. So, and once you've done that, a lot of those skills stick with you. You may be a little bit rusty at some point, but I've been drawing and painting on and off for 30 years, and it's been very helpful. So before I get too far, I need to measure that again because I just started painting away, just talking and painting. So um, that was not a great idea to stop paying attention. Okay, so that's always been fine. It's this measurement here, the top to the tear duct. That's not too bad. I'm just going to get that little white spot in there so that I can better know where I am. So, but it's only in the last couple years, I would say, that I've been really focused on portrait painting. I've done all kinds of mostly painting in this alla prima style, alla prima. Um, I've been part of a plein air painting group, which is the practice of painting outside. It's in on the East Coast called the Mid Atlantic Plein Air Painters Association, And I focused on that for several years. And going back after I got out of school, I had lived in New York City, and I was doing a lot of architectural landscapes and still lifes for um, mostly for food and travel magazines. And but I always had in the back of my head that what I really like to do was draw and paint people's faces. Um, but I never knew like in what context would I be doing that, because you'd have to be hired by magazines to do that specifically, and you'd have to have a portfolio of, usually it'd be celebrities' faces if you wanted to get work, um, editorial work painting faces, or you would have a portraiture business, and that required painting in a certain way, which I didn't really, wasn't really my style to do these very large, tight, um, realistic paintings of people, because my style is much looser. Um, so yes, so Anne asked, "Great, is this your first live? You're doing great. This is my second one. I did one last week, just as kind of as a trial. I didn't announce it. I didn't really let anyone know. I just went live, and a few people did through the YouTube notification, came in to watch, and I have that recorded if anyone's interested in watching it. I have the original version where the sound is very low, and then I reposted it with the sound improved. And let me see, we have, my eyesight's not too good on this. Okay, so we have about 8 people in here right now, which is great. I didn't know really what to expect. Hopefully more people will continue to join in. Please feel free to ask questions. I'm going to look over my shoulder occasionally to see um, what people have asked. So just so you know, the first one that I did last week, it took me 2.5 hours to do the the portrait, the head study, and I want to be able to do that quicker. Sometimes when I'm talking, it slows me down a little bit, but I'm going to try to keep on moving and do things that help it progress faster. And I hope that each time I do this, that it'll be a little bit shorter. Then it becomes a little bit easier to watch the whole thing. It's easier to watch something for an hour and a half than it is for 2.5 hours. So that's one of my goals, is to become a little more efficient. Just in general, whenever I'm doing this as a practice, to be able to more quickly get to the point would be a little nicer. Now I can see that the way I've painted her nose, I've painted it more at an angle than it really is. So just little things like this in the end are going to help the likeness. And I tend to have a pretty strong likeness in my studies. I know a lot of people, they tend to stylize more, and so the fact that it doesn't look so much like the reference isn't a big deal. I like it to look a little bit like the person, because part of what, usually what I'm attracted to when I pick out a photo is that let me move the brushes out of this out of my Gamsol cup, so that you guys aren't hearing it rattle each time. Um, so yeah, so usually what I'm attracted to about the photo is the expression of the person, or something about the lighting, and um, some aspect about it. And usually if I'm not um, doing a fair enough job of getting the values and the placement of the the features of the photo, then I'm usually end up losing those things that I really liked. Um, and it's really hard just to paint those things without everything else working around it. So I tend to have slow down at the end of a painting to try to make sure that all those the values and the placement is where I want it to be. And more recently, I'm taking my time as I put down strokes to try to get everything in the right place to begin with. And again, that saves a little bit of time, and so because it means you have to do a lot less correcting. Okay, so right now I am I'm sorry. So Kristen is asking me to talk a little bit about my color process. At some point, I need to do a video just about my palette and my color mixing, and it's a little hard to explain. But mostly, I have a high key palette, which is every color on my palette is the strongest color possible to have for that in that hue, whether it's a transparent or an opaque color. And for the most part, I'm just mixing with white. Because most of these colors are fairly light, the white takes down some of the intensity of the color, so it doesn't look so garish. But at some point, I also need to come in and be mindful of some of those of the grays and and cool colors or warmer colors that are more neutral interface. Again, I'm going to have to measure um, the separation of lips. Um, yeah, so I'm too high with her lips. Let me. Is the nose right? Thought I measured that. The nose is in the right place. I just have the top of her lip too high and then the separation too high. Um, it's amazing how far off some of these things can be when you're not paying attention. So back to color. So I am just, in a way, I use a color mixing method for the most part, which is called tint, tone, and shade. So tint is when you mix white with a color. Tone is when you mix black and white or gray with a color. And shade is when you're mixing only black with that with a color. And so generally going for the color, you pick out the color based on the hue you want, and you can use black and or white to lighten or darken, or you use a combination of both to knock down the intensity. So if you want to just change the intensity from a color that's too intense, then you would mix black and white to the same value as the color that you're trying to change the intensity. And when you mix those two colors, a strong color with a gray that are the same value, the only thing essentially that you're changing is just the intensity of that color. And the more gray that you put in, the less intensity, and the more of the color you put in, the stronger the intensity. So there's only a few variables in color. There's the there's the hue of the color, there's the intensity or the chroma of the color, and then there's the value of the color, which is how light or dark. And then another aspect of the color tends to be the transparency of the color. And the transparency is a little that's a little bit harder to for people to understand, but it reacts differently with the light, since light, if a color is very transparent, then the light is traveling through the color and picking up the color underneath or behind it. Generally, in this case, if it's a white board, then the transparency is the light passing through the color, hitting the white of the board, and the brighter the board, the brighter the color, and the brighter the light, the brighter the color. And then that light, it bounces off the board and back through the color, and then that's what is hitting your eye, that light, that wavelength of light that's being affected twice, bouncing through the color and bouncing back of the color. And then if it's a semi-transparent color, you're also getting some color from the surface of the paint also. I always say that transparent colors can be made much brighter than just the regular color. So let's say I have, let me see, what's a good example? If I put down a little red, that's actually fairly transparent. That looks pretty bright, but if I can paint with it transparently, let's thin it out a little bit, you can get an effect. Usually in the light areas, let's say I needed to go very light with a color, so I'm going to mix it with white. This is where you lose some of the intensity of the color, just a light pink. So that's that same red with white mixed in it. And if I needed to have the same value, I can just thin it out. If I can get some clean thinner. And I can get a similar value by painting next to it transparently. And that transparent color can be much more intense than the color mixed with white. And so that is why one technique, glazing, where you're putting the transparent color over black and white underdrawing or a gray underdrawing, allows you to get some really rich colors. Now I got to paint over that, so that gives me some of the pinks in the cheek. If I can get some white in there. Okay. I hope that helps. So I said that one form of color mixing is tint tone shade color mixing. Another approach is complementary color mixing. And essentially what you're doing there is you're mixing colors from across the color wheel to affect, in some cases, the value and the hue of the color if it's not straight across the color wheel. Or if you have two colors that are straight across from each other, you're essentially just, depending on which color you have more of, you're changing the intensity of the dominant color. It's dropping intensity. So if you have a strong red mixed with a strong green and you have more of the red, what you're going to end up with is a duller red color. And by mixing that way, you can achieve a lot of the same colors as tint tone and shade color mixing, but you can't get the same, generally you can't get the same level of intensity with complementary color mixing. But I use both approaches when I paint. I both complementary color mix and I tint tone and shade. But a lot of times I complementary color mix by using what's called analogous colors. And analogous colors are colors that are on the color wheel that are neighbors. And when you start mixing a bunch of neighbors together, depending on how wide apart you get, that can affect the intensity of the color, but you get some pretty interesting color effects. So if I start mixing a purple with an orange, you're going to lose some of the intensity of the color, but the color mixture is going to be a fairly interesting gray. That I like to use that particular combination a lot in hair when I'm painting hair, because it gives kind of an interesting auburn color that you can get in several different ways, but that's a good one. The purple that I use is an extremely intense purple. It's called dioxazine purple. It's one of the strongest colors on my palette. Just a little bit affects all the colors very much. And so sometimes I use it as an accent color to get a strong dark color in shadow or in a crease in the face, like let's say underneath the chin. Let me measure this first before I go too crazy. So the chin's about there. So I can use some of the purple on that spot, and it's a very strong color. I don't know if you can see the color on the camera. Make sure that you get the ear in the right place. Doo, doo, doo. So the ear comes up pretty high. Getting the shape of that jaw is pretty important, so I may have to come in and adjust that. But you can see how strong that purple is. I don't know if that helped you a little bit understanding my mixing without visually seeing my palette. But like I said, I'm going to do another video soon where it's just me talking about how I mix colors. And generally, I don't use a palette knife to mix. I just take the brush that has variable amounts of Gamsol, which is my odorless mineral spirit, and depending on what I want to achieve, I'll have the brush either fairly wet or fairly dry, and then I dip into the colors that I want and start mixing in the open area of my palette. Usually I'm contaminating my colors each time a little bit, which is the downside of using a brush, because each time you stick the brush in a color, you're putting back some of the color that's already on the brush into your piles of color. If you're strategic about it, you can kind of hit the front edge of your piles so that if you really need to get at some super clean color, you can kind of approach it from the top, and or pull out the palette knife if you really are struggling to get the clean as color as you want. Again, I'm not sure if I have the separation in the mouth at the right place. I will try. See, it's still, that's still too high. And because of where I have the camera and how I have everything set up, it's a little bit harder for me to see, but that's why I'm doing a lot of measuring too. And interesting, have kind of a cool bluish white on her upper lip that's going to create a lot of interest, so I want to see if I can get some of that color in there now. Maybe not too strong. I've also done a little bit of adjusting of the photo in Photoshop to make sure that I have the values of the highlights compared to some of the other features in at the right value, so that those highlights will stand out. And it also gave me a little bit wider value range in her facial features, so that I wasn't struggling trying to have to get the right value in a photo that that her flesh was really pale in the original photo that I got, and so there was such a narrow range of values that would have impeded my progress a little bit. It's not. It's sometimes it's very nice to do a portrait painting where the facial features are very pale. It's one kind of sort of effect, lighting effect, but not in this case where I'm doing a quick study. I think that would be too much of a challenge. So, oh, well, I went really dark and intense with that red right there. So I'm going to see if I can drop it a little bit. Just come back with some blue on top of it and try it again. Okay, that's a little better. So I go back and forth between using alizarin permanent, which is my intense cool red, It's a transparent color. I'll use that in things like inside the nostril, so I get sort of the reddish light that you would naturally see inside the nostril, or reddish shadow, I should say, and or just using black, and it just depends on the painting, um, what it looks like it needs. And if you hear a meowing sound, that's my cat Pasha. Okay, if you have more questions, please, go ahead and ask, because otherwise I'll just start rambling aimlessly about um, the step that I'm on. I need to make sure that the value of that far cheek is dark enough so that it looks like it is turning away. It's also getting shadow from the hair. So that's going to be, the value of that cheek has to be a lot darker than the, the near cheek. And this is where I start mixing a little bit of green into the pinks, getting some of that, what I would say is more of a complementary color mixing idea to get some of interesting colors in where the form's a little bit darker. So it looks like a pretty neutral color there, but that's just from adding green and a little bit of purple into what's essentially red and white. And that's helping knock down some of that color. I see some pink reflected light, not not reflected light, highlights, um, where this form starts to turn. And the top of the nostril is not that dark a red. It's important to get some of the subtlety of the value changes. That's going to make it feel more like real flesh than being so punchy with the values. And I don't want to say it's a rookie mistake, but it's very common when artists don't have a lot of experience and they see a color or a value change, that they'll hit those changes really hard. I was doing that up until very recently. And if you're able to get those subtle changes the way they actually are when you're painting from life or from a photo, then um, you get some those really nice subtle changes in direction and lighting that you couldn't get in any other way. And so it's a matter of looking back and forth between the reference and your painting to make sure that those changes are the same or similar, and not what your brain wants to do is say, because you're really focused on those small areas, your your brain wants to make those changes much stronger. Kristen had another question. It seems like you do some color mixing on the canvas too. Do you ever have issues with muddiness? So that's a good question. So my issues more than muddiness are with over blending, and it's a I wouldn't say it's a bad habit, because it allows you to get, in some cases, some very subtle transitions in form, but um, but then you do end up having also some issues where you're losing some color intensity, and that's where some people say that there's it seems like it's muddy, um, especially since you may have more intense colors going down, but it mixes with the colors underneath, and it ends up being a little bit of a mess. And so I don't have trouble with that so much, is because if I'm mixing with the colors that are already down, I'm doing a little bit of a calculation in my head, like I'm overcompensating for what I want. So if I know something if I'm painting into a light area with a dark and there's already a lot of paint down and they're both going to mix together, I may start off a lot darker so that what I end up with, or a lot brighter in color, so what I end up with ends up being closer to the right color. There's things that you can do if you're painting more thinly with paint, then it will end up mixing more with the color underneath. If you're painting thicker with the paint, then you can get the paint to lay more on top of the colors underneath. Generally, there's some exceptions to that. If you already have so much thick paint down, then it becomes really hard to paint on top of the thicker paint, and so sometimes you have to pull away some of the paint that's already down first, so that you can get come back on top with a thicker color. When I um, when I paint the I keep on saying reflected light. When I paint the highlights on the face, those are generally the very light areas where the light's reflecting directly from your main light source, from your key light. Then um, then I will generally load a tip of the brush with a lot of white or a lot of that light color, and just very lightly get touch the panel with it. So just a tip of that or dab of that paint will sit just right on top of the surface. So things like the reflections in the eyes, the catch light of the nose, which will be this little spot here in the nose, and I'll give you an example. So I'm just putting a little bit of white just on the very tip, and then if I'm very careful, I can just get the little bit of that white to sit right on top. And so um, that may not be in the right place yet, and I can then carve or move that or remove it and do it again until I get it to look the way I want. May take a few tries. Um, do I ever let the painting dry, then go over it again with glazes or highlights, or always alla prima finished result? That's a question from Anne. And um, so letting the painting dry usually is a product of me needing longer on the painting than I have time to paint. And then the paint will sit. And if I hadn't put any um, linseed oil or safflower oil um, in my solution, then that paint will dry on the surface in a day or two, and then then it's much harder to work wet into wet. And what I usually end up doing is repainting over most of the surface where I want to make changes until I have a base of color that I can paint into to get similar effects. And so that's the price of having to step away from a painting for too long, is to get it to the point where you left it, where you have to get everything kind of re-wet. And I tend not to glaze. It changes sort of the surface quality of the painting, and it really has a different look. And it's not really my style of painting. I like to see the big, thick brush strokes in my finish. And so I will work really hard to try to maintain that. I'll even grab towards the end increasingly bigger brushes so that I can um, get some of those strokes in if I don't have them already. Um, so it looks like I just painted everything in one go, but um, let's see if I can get the color of the underside of that lip. Is sort of a fairly intense, cool red. So I'm using, again, one of my stronger colors, which is quinacridone red. I've only started using this recently. It started when I had a painting with a girl that had a bright pink blouse on, and I was really frustrated that I couldn't get that color, and so started looking around for a color in that hue I that would help me. So either quinacridone red. Some people prefer uh, quinacridone violet, and I'm sticking with the red because it fits nicely in between my naphthol red and my alizarin permanent. And alizarin permanent is a substitute for alizarin crimson. I use almost exclusively Gamblin paints and artist grade, and Gamblin, the company Gamblin, has come up with a substitute for alizarin crimson because it um, where it was traditionally used, um, it isn't very light fast, and so those that color will fade over time. So alizarin permanent is a synthetic color. It's what Gamblin calls a modern color, which is a replacement for um, what they call mineral colors, which are the more traditional colors. And generally, those modern colors can be much more intense. And one of the virtues is more intense and more light fast, and have one aspect which I crave, which is tinting strength. And tinting strength is allows you to mix lots of white with that color, and that it still holds on to some of its color intensity. So right here, if you look in the chin area, she has some strong pinks there that are very light, and except that I've got a little bit of purple in there, so that's going to affect some of the intensity of that color. But if I didn't have that color, then I would be trying to mix the alizarin crimson with the naphthol red to get that color, and that would be cause it to drop in intensity, and then mixing white with that would cause it to drop in intensity again. And so having that high key quinacridone red allows me to get those colors that I want. And so getting back to um, to Kirsten's question, which was, do I have trouble with muddiness? And generally, no. It's because I'm looking to match certain colors that are in the resource, and I'm trying to get the level of intensity that's there. And I think that some of trouble with muddiness happens a lot when people are artists are trying to mix large areas of color together instead of picking out the changes in color. They're just sort of blending a whole bunch of colors together, and that is going to create um, a sense of muddiness, I guess, generally muddiness or grayness. Um, but that said, having some areas of gray um, in your flesh tones is very important because it's uh, a natural feature of flesh tones. I think sometimes you'll see a face that's painted and all very strong reds or oranges, or just a mixture of only reds and oranges with no relief of any cool colors or colors from across the spectrum. And the overall effect will be kind of like it'll look like a spray on tan a little bit. And okay, I have another question, I think. Cool colors, warm colors. Do you concern yourself with this in your technique? Cool colors recede, warm colors forward. Not exactly in that way. Cool and warm colors um, forward and back, except sometimes where there's an edge that's turning away from the viewer. It is sometimes helpful to knock down the intensity as it recedes or move across the color wheel to get that effect. And let me fix some of the drawing underneath the nose as I'm doing talking about this. Um, yeah, that's better. Um, but what I tend to look at, and this is an impressionistic idea, which is your light source tends to be one temperature and your shadow another. So if your light source is warm, then your shadow tends to be cool. And if your light source is cool, then your shadow tends to be warm. And so you can look for, I can't even, didn't really think about it yet, but it does look like there's a um, cool light source or coolish, I would say, kind of more towards the violet end of the spectrum. You can see some of the reflected lights around the eyes and the nose and on the tip, which will be sort of a kind of a violet or bluish color. And then that will mean that the shadows will be the opposite side of the spectrum, which would be um, reds and oranges, maybe a little bit of yellow. So accentuating that that warm cool difference will help create a sense of light. If you just go with kind of all over brown in the light side and all over brown in the shadows, then it will feel like a 17th century painting where everything's just painted the same hue. It wasn't really till the Impressionists that you really started to have some of those color variations in the flesh. So Randy asks, Rembrandt permanent matter deep is identical to original alizarin. Um, I don't know that much about the color or its permanence or transparency, but since I have this alizarin permanent, it fits um, perfectly a space in my palette in between two other colors. And so I haven't really looked. It's also helpful for me on the Gamblin website. They um, show you the colors, what they call the mass, a mass tone, which is just a thick version of the color painted down. There's a transparent area of the color, and where you see the light coming through, and then a version of the color mixed with black, white, and gray, so that you can see in each case how the color holds up. Now, obviously, if you're looking at it online or on printed material, it's not going to be exact, but it does give you a pretty good idea. And the description, which allows you to know things like the transparency of the color and the um, transparency of the color and its tinting strength. And I said it again, tinting strength is something that is very important to me since I use a high key palette and depend on the high key for some of my color mixing. Um, and so I tend to stay away from colors that don't have a high tinting strength. It's that idea isn't right for everybody. So I just want to say that up front. If you're doing different types of color mixing, um, it it's a little bit of a hindrance for a beginner that doesn't have a good sense of control over colors and intensities to be working with such strong colors because you have to do a lot of work in some cases to gray the color. And so what'll happen in a lot of cases is that if you're just learning, you're a student and you have these high key colors, it's really easy to have the color get out of control. And so using a limited palette is is useful to keep uh, the colors harmonizing because you don't have such a a possibility of going way too strong with a color. So I have Anne asking, do you use umbers to cool or warm your tones, or even at all in your palette? Raw umber, raw sienna, burnt sienna. Um, Forgive me if you've already shown your palette, and I haven't. So, and don't worry, it's useful to explain my palette in that regard. So there's a traditional palette will have these kind of colors. Will have Van Dyke browns or burnt umber or burnt sienna. Um, I used to have them in my palette, and they were very useful for getting, in some respects, a dark warm very quickly. I didn't have to mix it, and those colors tended to be fairly inexpensive, so it was it saved me some money instead of mixing some very expensive uh, high key colors together to get a rather dull color. Um, I could just buy a tube of the dull color and use it where I needed it. And but those kind of earth tones, and they really are earth tones because they're made out of dirt generally, with various degrees of iron oxide, which gives it its reddish color. Like burnt umber is much a stronger red than raw umber because you're activating the oxidation process by cooking the color. But those colors tended to be more opaque and had kind of a dullness to them, which I didn't really like. And and some of these very high key colors aren't any more expensive. They because they're made in a factory and made in huge volumes, and they're not rare minerals like the cadmium colors. They tend to be series one or two, which means um, that they're not as expensive as those other colors, and they provide a greater level of intensity and tinting strength. I don't know if a lot of people know that people who depend on CAD colors or cobalt, for an example, which is can be a very expensive color, but um, those colors don't hold up very well when you're in color mixing. They tend to dull rather quickly in a mixed form, and which is really maybe helpful for an impressionistic technique, but not helpful with the way that I mix colors. And I paying more money to get that um, um, for that color, but not get the level of intensity that I want is why I don't have it in the palette. And those umbers, those earth tones, I find I can very quickly get the same color just by mixing a little bit of black with one of my warmer or a mixture of my warmer colors. So okay, you said you knocked the question off, but in the replay of the video, it will show up again, or you're welcome to retype it in if you want. But but I got the question, so thank you, Anne. I'm having a little bit of trouble with placement of this eye, so I'm going to um, have to measure it again for the eighth time. So right there, and the height is. I got to get that corner of the eye in there again so that I have it where I need it. And I also have the eye at the wrong angle. It's a little hard because it's hard for me to see in the shadow of this photograph where the eyelid is exactly. And I'm going to paint out that little light spot because that's throwing me off. And I'm just going to put an indication of the highlight in there, even though it's not very strong. Just gives me an idea of where things are. Yep, that's looks like the right place. Oops, that's my brush. Okay, that's about where it needs to be. Okay, so landmarks are about right. Let me start to get this other eye in because that's going to help me a lot more than anything else. And she has a little bit of eyeshadow on. You can see a little bit of orange coming out of the crease of her eyelid there. And then she has some like smoky eyeshadow um, around the edge. And I'm going to try to keep some of that for interest. But also around the edges of the eye, or I should say around the middle of the eyelids. It's an area that naturally reflects light back at the viewer because of the it's bending in space. It catches the light at some point, so it's helpful to make sure you get that value transition in to help reinforce the dimension of the eyelid. I'm going to try to start to get the crease, which is sort of a reddish brown, reddish black mixture. I'm probably hitting this too hard, but it's okay because as I continue to paint, I can knock that down a little bit. And she has a really beautiful eye color. It's sort of it's a red and green mixture. Sort of changes as it goes around the eye. So, um, see if I can get that. Just gonna paint in that whole eye color to begin with. And the whites of the eyes generally aren't white. May have a spot that's reflecting the light that will be whiter, but tends to be a warm or cool gray. Sometimes I will end up making a mixture of white and pure ultramarine blue or phthalo blue to get that color because it's fairly light and the blues end up being a low level of intensity in that lighter range. So, but to get the blueness of the whites of the eyes, sometimes I need to make sure that that color is fairly pure. And then again, this is why I use a fairly high key palette so that I can get some of that color intensity. Phthalo blues, extremely strong color. Ultramarine blue doesn't really get to its full intensity until you start to add a little bit of white to it, and then it then gets stronger before it gets weaker again. And I'm going to put where there's eyelashes. I'm not going to get crazy with the painting individual lashes. I want to just get more of the general shape of the darkness of the eyelash mass, but a little bit of black mixed with the purple in that area. And some of my drawing is going to be a little bit off, and then I'm going to have to come back in and correct to get some of the relationships right. I I would take a little bit more time with some of these things if I wasn't giving a demo. Um, it's just a little bit harder for me to work systematically when I'm talking. It's just my brain doesn't um, doesn't pay attention as well. And sort of talking is a kind of a left brain. See if I can remember the sides of my brain. Talking is a left brain exercise, and I have all my synapses firing on one side, and painting and that looking, that observation and thinking spatially is the right side of the brain, and getting all those shape relationships. So artists that can do that well is give a demo and paint really well. I kind of tip my hat to them because it's sometimes can be really hard to do that. Um, Anne says, "Oh, I also wanted to say thanks so much for doing this. Very generous and helpful. Very, very good explanations as you work. The whys and hows. Good teaching technique." Oh, thank you. Um, I um, just to give a little bit of background of why I'm here is that I've started doing this exploration um, of portrait studies a few years ago, and then started getting a little bit curious more about social media and started posting to Instagram. And um, I was getting some likes and feedback, and started to pay attention to what my audience, who my audience was, and what they wanted, and started asking questions. And what I found out is, um, that my audience really, for an overwhelming amount of audience, weren't so much, uh, I guess, art collectors. They weren't extremely experienced painters. Most of them were artists that were coming looking for examples of work they liked and that they wanted to learn how to do. So, as kind of looking for reference points and people that they could try to understand the work by looking. And so I found that the more that I posted time lapse videos and detail shots of my work and some text explanations of what I was doing, the more um, the more positive feedback I would get. But I also and I felt like I wanted to be able to give my audience more of what they were looking for instead of just saying, well, hey, all I want to do is paint and not to worry about it. I wanted I wanted them to get some value out of what I was doing. But what I found, I did two live videos on Instagram, thinking that that was a good way of being able to show more and explain more. But Instagram as a platform um, is not a great place I found, to do live demos, because they have allow you to do 1 hour total for the for a live video, and then after a day, then it gets taken down. And if you said in advance that you wanted it archived, then it saved it. If you did it after the video is already recorded, then your video would just essentially disappear afterwards. And I found that kind of frustrating. I really wanted to be able to have that video as sort of an evergreen um, demo for people to come look at later. So that's when I started venturing over to YouTube and getting really and YouTube is a whole ecosystem in itself, and trying to understand how it works and how to post videos and use the system. Hold on, a little bit of water is going to help here. Yeah, there, better. And so one little bit frustrating thing about YouTube is you can make a great video and post it on there, but getting so people see it is another thing, and that requires building up subscribers and authority so that your video becomes more searchable and more suggested. So, and that sort of takes some time and effort to get there. And But I also found a little bit of frustration all the time that I spent in production of the videos, even after I would do a time lapse video and I would do a voiceover and I'd clean up my voiceover and then I would bring everything into Adobe Premiere and I would spend hours and hours producing a video and then I'd stick it up there and maybe if I was lucky, they would get some traction and people would see it. And so I'm just getting to the place now where I can put up a video and some of the people that are interested in that information, it's getting to them. Usually I have to go back to Instagram and tell people that I've posted something so that they'll go and watch it. Um, but eventually, I now have a little bit over 500 subscribers, and those are helping me get some of that visibility. But in doing that, I also am, like I was saying, the production time of the videos just meant that I was spending a lot of time producing the videos, but not very efficient in terms of getting out information about my process and what I was doing. And so then I started to look at more doing these live demos, which I think, in a way, are going to be more beneficial totally. It helps me get a little more visibility and more viewing hours, which YouTube likes. They want watch time, and that's the metric that gets your thing suggested more than anything else. And um, watch time. And the other thing is that I can go on for an extended period of time explaining something and interacting directly with my viewers, um, my subscribers, and it's a much more efficient way of getting information to people. I don't have to spend a lot of time in video production. So, now I forgot what the question was. Um, are you looking? Oh, you're just saying thank you. Let me see. I have to back up a little bit and see where I am in this feed. Okay, so are you, Anna? So are you doing the left and right brain things together? Oh, you are doing them quite well. The hat tip to you. Randy, AJ, do you consider yourself a high key painter? You seem to paint quite brightly. And I would say yes. If you missed some of my beginning explanation, I talked about how I tend to mix using a tint tone shade intensity or tint tone shade color mixing, um, mostly with white and the colors. Sometimes I'll put yellow instead of white. That'll help keep some intensity while keeping colors warm. And so that helps key everything up. But then I also have to be aware that to get the areas of color in my reference that are neutrals, because having everything high key, sometimes the color relationships end up being a little bit off, and so it's helpful to look for where the opposite colors in the opposite side of the color wheel or colors that are more neutral come in to help support some of those brighter colors. Um, I try not to paint in a way that things look overly garish. I want vibrancy, but I also want it to look natural, and so won't. I think it's over time I've gotten better at controlling the intensity of the colors um, so that the colors don't feel overly saturated, like I see right here in part of the cheek. And the reason why it's so bright in part of the cheek is because I did a little color mixing demo um, right on the panel there, and I'm still knocking down some of that color intensity. But you can see right in the mouth, around the mouth, there's this whole area that's gray, that's going much grayer. And that's important to get because how am I going to get the sense of color, of that reddish color in the cheeks, if I don't have that grayer or more neutral color supporting it? and more naturally you'll have less colors and less blood and color in the jaw area. And so it's a little bit darker too, so that's going to help the form to turn and where it goes into that shadow. Now, obviously, I put a little bit too much purple there, so coming in with black and alizarin crimson is going to help um, knock it down a little bit. Um, and you can start to see the form turning in space a lot more. And as I get to the point where I can see the turning in space, then painting it becomes easier because I feel like I'm painting not no longer on a flat surface, but I'm painting on the parts of the form that are facing in different directions. So this part of the area over the underneath the brow ridge right here is pointing more up, and then it turns down underneath as it gets to the fold of the eye. There's that little bit of the orange shadow, eye shadow that I talked about before. And then that crease in the eye is not just a line, but it's a line that is a little bit sharper on the bottom edge and then tends to be softer on the top. And that is going to give that sense of the fold of the skin. So if I, sometimes it takes a while working back and forth to get that, but once you get that in, and I don't have it quite sharp enough, but you start to get the sense of that fold coming out and over. And I'm going to look back. Okay, so um, have I have you ever considered lead white to keep the colors from cooling? I love lead for many reasons. What do you think of it? Well, I don't love working with something that's toxic, and now my kids are a little bit older, so it's not much as a concern of them coming over to my palette and eating the paints, um, but just in general, I'm kind of a sloppy painter, and a lot of the paint gets on my skin and on my face, and on my hands, and if I can keep the toxicity of the colors down, then I'm happy. Um, I'm also getting some of the solvent in on my hands too, and that increases the absorption of the paint into my skin. I know a lot of artists that they won't paint unless they have latex gloves on, but I personally don't do that. And so, but there's other ways of getting warmer white. There's if you look on Gamblin's website, they have a range of whites. They have a brilliant white, which I'm thinking about getting for cooler colors, which is a titanium white that uses, instead of linseed, uses safflower oil as a base. So there's nothing in the white that would cause it to be um, have any yellow in it, whereas linseed tends to have a yellow drawing quality. And so because of that, it has a much cooler and brilliant light effect to it. So I, at some point, I'm going to switch from titanium white probably to that brilliant white, and or radiant white rather, and and I haven't yet because when I wanted to order it from Dick Blick, they were out of stock. So and at that point, I didn't back order it. I probably should have, but I'd like to at least play around with it a little bit. There is a there is a white. It's like I'm trying to think of what they called it. It was like a lead white substitute. I could wonder if I can bring it up real quick. The Gamblin website. Gamblin colors. I'll do. Wait for the page to load. I'll continue painting. Let's see how my different sides of the brain work when I start to multitask completely. Um, Go to color, artist oils, and then I can look in they have their colors separated by hues and by category. So let me see if I can find their whites. Here are the whites. They have something called warm white. Um, they have a flake white replacement, which would be uh, a replacement for lead white. And let's see what it says. Uh, First true non-toxic alternative to flake white. It's the leanness of Gamblin white's terrific underpainting white. Um, and I would encourage you to go to Gamblin's website and read some of the color descriptions and some of, if you're looking possibly for, in some cases, less expensive or more intense colors or replacement of colors that are um, not not light fast. I would highly encourage that. This highlight on her cheek is, um, hold on, let me close this window so I can see your comments. The highlight on her cheek here is kind of has a purple, pink sense to it. I'm going to try a little bit of the quinacridone red, a little bit of the dioxazine purple, and then a whole lot of white, and see if I can hold on to some of that color. Have to go very light though to get it. Um, and since I want so much color in that, I'm gonna have to go darker all the areas around that, and then all of the color values in general to get that light to read. And so, and then I have this top of her cheek, which I have too dark. It's a much subtler transition. And then a little bit of blue in purple in here in the in that area underneath her eyelid. That sort of triangle shape that you get between the side of the nose and the top of the cheek. I tend to look for that because it's sort of one of those landmarks that I see in most people's faces, and try to make sure that I have it in there, because that will help the sense of form, the turning of the form there. More questions. Let me see. Um, okay, cooling lead white. Aya, this is looking gorgeous already. Thank you, Aya. Um, the interactive video is a huge saving for your time, so you can paint more. I interactive video. Oh, you mean this video, this live video? Yeah, it is a big time savings because it would generally take me about 15 hours to put together the 5 to 10 minute video for YouTube, where this I'm just painting for a couple few hours and then it gets posted. So that is a time savings, which leads me to a question that I wanted to ask, which is I'm thinking about doing this possibly every week. I didn't know how many people would come back to watch every week, especially since if I'm covering some of the same information, and I try to come up with different things to say each time, so I'm not being so repetitive. But maybe some people would be interested in coming back once a month. Um, maybe some every week. They'd be, if I do it on, let's say, every Tuesday night, would they be willing to come back and watch for a little bit each Tuesday night? So if you don't mind leaving a comment just saying like, yeah, once a week sounds great, or maybe every other week, or whatever it is that fits your interest and schedule, so I have an idea. Maybe it's a whole other group of people that watch this on another week and I end up doing it anyway. It is something that I anticipate will really help my, I don't know if you call it ratings, my, my suggestibility in my rankings. I guess it's more rankings to do these live videos, and they're in a way a time saver. It just takes a little bit more mental energy to kind of be on sort of performing um, and doing it this way. Um, Here, a couple of people said, Randy said every week, Ann says weekly. Um, and if anyone else, let me see, there's 11 people here supposedly, so if you chime in too, that would be helpful. Um, and that said, also, if you subscribe to my channel, but you also, there's a, when you're subscribing or when you go to my channel page, there's also this bell icon that's for notifications. And unless you ask for notifications, I may be posting a video or going live, and you may not be notified. Um, so it sort of defeats the whole purpose of subscribing. I'm not sure why YouTube does it that way, but they've just changed it recently. So unless you subscribe and you select notifications, you click on that bell, then YouTube decides who they're going to send the notification to that hasn't specifically requested notifications. So it's generally what I hear. It's about 10% of your subscribers they'll send the notification to just as a test of how popular the response is, and then maybe they'll send it to more people after, notify more people after that. Just trying to get some of the darks in. This helps me because then I can more easily judge values. Um, there's some of the interesting purples in the dark sides of the hair, at least in how I've color corrected this photograph, and sort of like that. Let's see if I can get the landmark of this eyebrow a little clearer, because that's going to also help me um, figure out where I am. Looking at the relationship of the two eyebrows together, has this very square shape. Want to keep that, and then it has kind of dips down. Great. So right now when I'm mixing color, you can't see the palette, but I'm just darting from one pile of color to another, because what I'm doing is searching for something close to the color that I want already on the palette, and then I'm mixing uh, other colors into that, maybe from one already mixed area to another, or pulling in fresh color to try to alter it to get the exact color that I want. That is the main way how I color mix in and out of piles of color. This helps harmonize the color, and it helps create the range of colors and intensities and values that I will find and use over and over again in areas of the painting, especially in the flesh tones. I will, unfortunately, I really can't move the camera at this point, but um, it looks like a chaotic mess of colors on my palette, and that's kind of what I need to get um, the richness and variation of colors that I'm looking for in her face. And that's partially what's going to help it feel natural. I think I'm wondering if I missed a question. Red light, Aya's question. Um, Anne asked me about time savings. Um, balance with your viewers being able to watch it anytime they want and as many times. Yes, that's a big plus all the way around. I do have to schedule in advance on my family's calendar, so everyone knows that's what I'm going to be doing on Tuesday nights, if that's the night that I decide to do it. But um, I used to have a painting workshop that I would go to on, and I still may go to on some nights, but um, that was generally on Tuesday nights. So in a way, I'm just replacing that workshop with this live video. So it's 8:30 right now. I've been painting for an hour and a half. This is about where I want to get to in terms of having the painting finished. I don't see how I would do that. So 2.5 hours is about so another full hour is probably what I'm gonna need to finish this painting, and to get some of the subtleties that I'm looking for. I'm gonna need a lot of time to kind of go back and forth and correct things and get these sort of subtle transitions. I'm just actually, in a way, at this point, going over with a fairly dry brush. That's a blending. I'm blending, and I try not to do that too much. I'm trying to dip into the color each time I go up, because then I'm coming down with um, fresher color. It maintains that feeling of the alla prima brush strokes, the bravura, which is also called, um, and makes it just feel more freshly painted. When something gets over blended, it has kind of an overall uh, lacklusterness, and you lose all that interest in the brushstrokes. Okay, here's where I want to come in with that color and the highlight of the cheek. That's reading pretty well. It's very subtle, has the right amount of color in it, and um, interest in the brushwork. And I think that one thing that people like about my work is that they can see the brushwork in the finished painting, and um, that's what excites me about John Singer Sargent's paintings and other alla prima painters, is actually that sense of the immediacy of the paint. I'm not, Bouguereau's okay. I know a lot of people that are Bouguereau fanatics. I find the work a little staid just because it's almost overly careful. I mean, he got some beautiful sense of flesh and anatomy, um, but I'll take a Sargent any day over a Bouguereau. Um, so see right there, I got this really interesting green. I'm going to try to maintain some of that color. It's so close to being neutral, very subtle, but the play in the color is just so nice. Who knows? I may end up painting over it to get to where I'm going, but when I see some of those color variations in the flesh, I know that I'm doing it right. Um, and I have some of the darker hair coming in, and then I'll have the ear. Okay, so got the ear next to that. So it's just part of painting is just putting one shape against another shape. But be careful. The bottom, I have that bottom of the ear too low. You can see I have to carve into that to get it to where it needs to be. So I have to be mindful of some of these things as I'm putting them down, or the face won't hold together that well. I have to go even higher. Sorry about that. There. That's much closer to where it needs to be. And now, oh yeah. So I was saying that the part of the painting is just is this relationship between from one shape to the next. That's an important part of the underlying drawing of the painting. The other part is the careful placement of values, textures, and color to get those shapes to move forward or recede in space to give that sense of volume. Um, it's interesting if you can have a painting that works well on a graphic level, and that would be the composition or the design. Um, or possibly a juxtaposition, an area of interest that seems extremely flat against an area that sort of the 2D against the 3D. I I love that in artist work like Gustav Klimt's work, where he does this very flat 2D pattern. A lot of times, some of the clothing or objects will cut into the form and make extremely interesting or strange silhouette shapes against very carefully rendered areas of form, like parts of the face or hands that are, um, or figures that intentionally are moving in and out, almost like with like a 3D glasses effect coming in and out of the canvas. And that was one of the things that he loved in his work, or one of the, I mean, obviously something that he focused on a great deal, is creating that juxtaposition between the 2D and the 3D. Um, yeah, so, and saying that I need to adjust. I'll get to some of that adjustment soon, of color and where the cheekbone is. Usually before I'm done, I'll repaint the cheekbone, that turn and space of the that lower jaw. I'll paint it probably 50, 60 times, make 50 that many adjustments to it before I feel it's right. Because part of what gives a sense of likeness, or um, having the forms turn correctly in space, is getting that overall shape of the head and having it turn in space in the right way. And even more than having like the eyes and the nose in the right place, if you can get the overall shape of the head and getting it to read properly, um, that's can be even more important. I had a friend say that getting the features right, getting, the eyes, nose, and mouth right in terms of getting someone's likeness, um, it's a trap. that that isn't the main thing. Getting the shape of the head, that's the deal, um, to getting that sense of likeness. So don't get too caught up. I'm just going to change brush size a little bit. My poor beat up brushes, just so I can get the pupil of the eye in with a little bit smaller brush. So I just need to have a little more control over the form there as I get some parts of this eye to read, and then it will be more apparent where I am in the painting. Okay, I don't have enough orange in her eye, in that green. It's sort of a, is that hazel? I don't know what to call that color, but she does have green eyes, at least in this photo. Um, and I have to be careful to get the top of the iris dark enough, because it is in shadow underneath the eyelid. The same with the whites of the eye, um, is in shadow. And unless I make that dark enough, the eyelid won't read properly. It'll look like it's all flat. Um, and I have the shape of the iris off a little bit, but I can adjust. In fact, I have the eyelid too, not quite deep enough. And I have a pinkish color right at the top here. So I'm gonna have to repaint where I put the crease of the eye. A little bit easier now. I have this smaller brush. So. Okay, that's too high, but okay, that's a little better. And I said that there has to be that softness of that edge. I'm just gonna see if I can get some of that. Okay, so now I can start to look back and forth between the photo and the painting and start to see where some of my shapes are off and start to correct those. one by one until I kind of get some of this painting under control. I need the lower eyelid in the right place. Have a dark, kind of purple dark here. And you can see I'm starting to slow down a little bit because I need control to get these things. The sharpness, accent, and okay. Same with the top eyelash. I'm not putting in individual eyelashes yet just because I'm going to be adjusting the color of that eyelid more. And if I put in the eyelashes, then I paint around them. And I don't want to do that because that's never going to be a good outcome. Play with. Okay, so one thing to also note is that I have the white of the eye, kind of this flat shape. It's all one color. And this really has to be, uh, it's a ball. So it has to be turning in space. So in the photo, I can see it's much lighter. I kind of have a little bit of a mess there that I have to clean up, or I can leave it like that as long as it's reading properly. But as it moves towards the tear duct, it is getting a little bit redder and a little bit darker. And I can exaggerate that so you really do feel that turn. And plus, with the shape of the tear duct, really do can help accentuate that feeling that it's turning. And remember what I said is that the light of the eye will be a little bit darker just underneath the lid. So it's like a drop shadow. If any of you are graphic designers out there, that drop shadow will help lift the eyelid up above the eye. And I don't have that transition there soft enough. It just looks okay. So that is just starting to read. I would love it if I had just like a hit of white there to really feel the light reflecting off that part of the eye. I can adjust the pupil a little bit, make it higher because it is actually a little bit higher. Sorry, in a minute I'll get to some of your questions. Um, okay. Um, so this is where I have to go thicker with the black because I need it to really be black. And next to, this is where there's the most contrast in the painting, and it's sort of a focal point, whereas I have the black of the pupil, and then I have that highlight right there. And that highlight, if I do it right, will really feel like it's light hitting on that one part. If I just get a little bit of light in the right here, that'll help. And bring that light around. And then I need just a hit, a dark hit on the outer edge of this pupil. Okay, I think that's getting close to where I want it to be. Still, if I squint down, and squinting, I can't say this enough, squinting is the most important tool in your toolbox because it allows you to reduce down um, all of the brush strokes and the detail to see the overall effect. You get the same thing with backing up away from the from your work area and looking at it from a longer distance. But if you sit down without moving very much like I do while I'm painting, um, that getting up becomes a little bit harder. Right now, I'm just going to make sure I have a little bit of darker value here on the edges of her eye. So that, and then I'm just, it's not really there in the photo, but I'm going to put it in anyway. Kind of a little bit of a highlight on her upper lid, um, so that it accentuates that. And with the same idea, I can do that where the top, and it actually is in there in the photo. If you look, there is a highlight on the upper edge of the eyelid, of the lower lid rather, and then make that a little bit thinner. And then the same thing is happening on the lower lid. It goes light in the middle, and then it's getting darker on the sides. And so what I'm doing here by taking the whole thing together is that I'm really forcing the viewer to see that as a very round shape that's moving towards you in the middle and moving away from you on the sides. And um, just by really paying attention to those values and just have an understanding that that's what I needed to do, even if it isn't apparent in the photograph, to get that effect. Um, so that I know when I do that successfully, people like the photos a whole lot more because that interest in the eye, where it's just catching the light and reading right, um, is I think the whole rest of the painting can be crap, and people will like that. Okay, so Anne says 50, 60 times. I think I've watched most of your videos, so I do know this, but this is great, this live video. You are doing a great job and imparting a terrific amount of useful information. Also, recall you were concerned with the delivery. It's articulate, entertaining, and also oddly soothing. Yes, that's my the ASMR quality of my voice that um, kind of like the Bob Rossness, I think. Either people will fall asleep or be completely relaxed. Well, um, maybe people will tune in just so that they can get uh, a good evening's sleep before they go to bed. Um, so thank you for that, Anne. That's very encouraging. I know. Let me see. I have yes 9 people here watching. I thought there would be a few more, but I think eventually more people will get to see this video. So I think it is in the end going to be, if I do this weekly, time well spent, as opposed to, I probably will do other types of content on my channel, but I think that this will be a good way to get more information out more easily. I see a lot of YouTubers, people who have had channels a long time, starting to do more and more live stream information um, because there's huge benefits to doing it that way, and the watch hours and the effectiveness of them being able to communicate and also to be able to field questions in real time, so that they know that the information they're giving people are directly related to what people want to find out about. Okay. So that said, let's see where I can move this painting along a little bit. Right now, I'm going to look for my bigger brush. Um, this is you can see I can paint a whole eyeball at once with that. But I'm going to start painting the hair. And I need to clean off a good chunk of my palette because I have so much white paint down mixed in everything. And the hair, I really do not want a whole lot of white in there. I want mostly, this is where I'm going to do a lot of my shading. I'm going to mix black with my my darker transparent colors to get that kind of richness and color shadow. So black with, oops, I thought that was purple. Black with purple. Maybe I'll throw a little red in there so that it gets back to. Okay, so I'm painting purple hair right now, but it's so dark that that color is not going to be overwhelming. And then I'm going to come in with lighter orange highlights, and that's going to give some interest. Um, okay. Okay. That looks like the face is reading pretty well right now. Okay, so I'm going a little thinner in some places so you can see the brushwork better. The orange that I'm adding adds a little bit of opacity to the color, and that actually is a good thing. If you look, if you look at my resource photo, which I think you can see pretty well, there is like a little seam here. So the original photo stopped right here, and I went into Photoshop and I used a few tools. There's um, what is it? Contents aware. You can fill an area, and you fill with something called contents aware, and it takes the information in the photo adjacent to it, around it, and it guesses what that new area of the photo would look like that you don't have information for. Doesn't always work that great, but it is a great tool if you want to extend out um, parts of the photo that you don't have. Can't do miracles, but it's great for adding background and areas of hair, and maybe the forehead just goes up a little bit higher, and you want it to go higher than what's in the photo. It works really well for those sort of things. And I don't need it to be perfect for the hair. I also added a little bit of what was her khaki shirt color, which you in a part of the photo that I've actually cropped out, um, because I wanted this to be an 8 by 10, but there was more horizontal space. And so I put that in. That is just the color that I wanted to against that orange and purple here. So I'm going kind of with a secondary color scheme here of purple, orange, and green. Um, that is, don't know if, from a color theory point of view whether that really does anything, but I just like the feel of it. Um, just even go a little bit redder in some of the areas. Okay, I see some more questions pop up. Um, I used to watch a girl from Kentucky, sounds like the beginning of a limerick, um, do makeup and look, and it took her about 6 months of Facebook Lives before she hit her stride, and now runs about 3 to 4 thousand viewers per broadcast. Okay, well that's interesting. I would be happy to, you know, get out of get out of the teens in terms of number of viewers, but I think the important part too is that people can come and look at the watch the broadcast later. And I see that if I look at the analytics, um, even if I do a 2.5 hour demo, the average viewer, and that's average, not the mean, um, ends up watching about 12, 13 minutes of it. Now, that may be some people watching the whole thing and then other people just clicking off right away because it didn't interest them. Um, so there probably are a fair amount of people watching the whole thing that 12 minutes really doesn't present very well. But um, it also means to say thank you in advance. Um, but so those tutorials, they they usually get in a few key points, and they tell a story. and I think that they're kind of short and sweet, and I like them for that. But um, in terms of, they're not sort of the end all be all because they take too much time to produce and they don't get enough information across. Um, but I kind of think of them as more inspirational and aspirational kind of messages um, about striving to do better work and understanding that sometimes getting a good painting out is a struggle and you just stick with it, um, and others that talk about what I was after in a painting and what I had to do to achieve it. Um, so I think those have worked so far. But I also like doing these live ones just because I get to talk about, um, as I'm working, the things that I'm thinking about, and I think that's really important um, for people. Okay, and so I am going to try to leave um, part of the palette bare if I can not be a little bit careful and make sure that I don't smudge into it because it has a nice graphic quality to it, and I don't have that far out enough yet. This is really close to the edge and I'm not, but I'm being careful so I don't go too far out to begin with. And this can have kind of a soft edge. It doesn't have to be so crisp because I do want the focal point to be the middle of her face, the eye, and I can go soft in a lot of areas that help support that. And one thing I don't do enough of, and I'm going to try to do more, is really exaggerate the edges, the hard and soft edges. I tend to be a little bit too literal with what I see in the photographs, and it's nice when you can get a sense of atmosphere or um, a depth of field. Oh, I can paint a second color around that edge, and that does help a little bit get a sense of a softer edge. And then I have the highlight and the hair up here that's yellow to orange to red. And then it all goes to purple. So you can see, even though a lot of the areas of the hair in the photo look rather black, I am using some black, but for the most part, I'm just um, maintaining the darkness of some of these transparent colors that give a sense of richness. Here, I'm actually going to bring in some black right here underneath the ear because I do think that it needs to then have some areas that really do um, not that don't have any light in them, so that it feels like it's the real recess of the hair, and then I can come in more with um, the colors, a little bit of the color around that. Okay, and I kind of feel this starting to shape up, and now. Um, So if I'm trying to finish this up in a half hour, I think I kind of feel like I can do that. Um, I haven't spent a lot of time adjusting the values in her face, and I do want to get to that. So I'm going to try to finish this hair quickly. Where's my big fat brush? Because that's what I need. Big fat, getting lots of purple, black, brown. Not brown, but reds and oranges in there. Okay, so that needs to go redder than I have it. I am just going to force that, maybe come in with a little bit of white so that that color reads in there. Yep, I need some white. Sometimes you just need white because it is reading lighter there. And then on top of that, oh, flying brushes. Oh. Top of that, I have some more highlights. This layering is going to give it more depth. I actually have too much orange in that. It's not that orange in the image, but it does have a little bit of a darker red first. See if I can get it in the right place. You can see some of the flesh tones through the hair. I want to paint that in. That are kind of getting a red cast now. This is the warm part of the shadow that's influencing that. So the shadow of the hair against the skin is sort of casting that reddish warm shadow. If I want it to read properly, I have to play around with it a little bit. The same up in here. And then I get the highlight of the hair, which is got a little bit of yellow, but mostly a neutral. Okay, got really quiet there for a second. Okay, and I'm going to carve back into this a little bit to shape it, make sure it... so if you watched, trying to think of which video it was, the One Girl Dance Party video. So I talked about how I talk about the shapes in the hair as being darts. They have sort of this this long, pointy shape to them. And most hair, especially if it's flowing, not like very curly hair, has these kind of shapes that move in and out. And if you pay attention to them and paint them properly, you kind of get the sense of the weaving of the hair forms in and out of space. And that's what I am trying to do at the moment. Okay, so trying to use my time judiciously here and finish up this painting. So I'm not going to spend too much time there. It has some nice flow of brush strokes and starting to read pretty well, and want to get this darker mass here underneath. Can leave some of it open, but I don't know how much I want to. And there. Okay. And for me to get this to work, I really need to get some of the subtleties in the face working more than the hair. So I'm going to try to finish this part off quickly. That's good. Okay, so that's it for the hair for now, except for one little thing right in here. Need this dark coming underneath her, alongside her face, and the orange that's against it. So I'm just coming in actually with pretty thick color now, because I want those colors to sit on top of the dark transparent colors that I put down. So with experience, it just comes how wet you want the paint, or how dry or how thick when you're painting into it to get the effect that you want. There's no substitute for people can tell you how to do it, but unless you do it 1,000 times, you don't really have a sense for it. That's I hate to say it, to get how do I say that? So to get the skill level up that most people want to paint to, it really does take a real commitment in time to just doing it, just a regimen where you're doing it all the time, because that is the only way to get sort of that repetition of skills to understand how to solve certain problems in the painting is just doing it over and over again. I have to say that my portraiture work, I had done a fair amount of it over the years and just felt completely frustrated because my work was not improving, and I was working in the basement of my house and spending long, late hours doing it and not really having the level of success that I wanted. And um, but at the same time, I was doing that. I was doing landscape painting. I was doing various commissions that weren't portraiture work, and so my attention about painting was just sort of scattered all over the place. And more recently, I have more like a laser focus on improving my portrait painting skills and painting primarily portrait painting. I really don't even have really much of an appetite for doing plein air painting. So I have opportunities to plein air paint, and I've only gone on one paint out this year, and it may be my last one for a long time. And and part of that is that I am in sort of this rhythm where I'm doing these. I want to improve my skill, and I'm doing sort of averaging about 100 studies and portraits a year. So it comes down to about 8 or so a month. And for me, that is what it's taking to improve my skills. I spent the first year or so of that time period really trying to understand the materials, the paint surface, and the type of brushes, and and the amount of thickness of paint, all those kind of variables that are just the materials themselves, just kind of understanding it better, trying all kinds of surfaces, playing with different amounts of primer or gesso on those surfaces. I played around with canvases, ampersand boards, speedball, Mona Lisa boards. Um, there was some other brand that I was using too. Oh, well, a couple different types of ampersand. There's the gesso board, and then there's also the value series, and each one has a level of different level of smoothness and absorption to it. So tooth and absorption, which are two different qualities, and figuring out that I wanted more absorption and more tooth that would eliminate sort of the streakiness of the brushstrokes and give me a little more value control. If I wanted the painting to have more of the streaks from the actual brush stroke, I could go with a slicker surface. But those are things that I knew that were variables that I could control. But that only came with lots of time experimenting and understanding those different variables. Also, creating a studio space. I have probably the world's smallest painting studio. It is literally a 4 by 4 area. I have on one side of me the powder room, downstairs bathroom, and on the other side, I have um, a litter box. I have a large sliding glass window behind me, which during the day I have to put blankets over the curtains so that I don't get too much light coming in through the windows. Um, and this is my painting space, but I'm able to control things like the lights. I have two lights coming from different directions that are color balanced. And I know they're color balanced because when I take photos of my work, the work doesn't go too cool or too warm. Maybe shifts a little bit warm. but overall, the lights are balanced. And that's important because it allows you to judge the colors and values a little bit better. When I was working in the basement, I would work and work and try to get subtleties and values to work, and then I would bring the painting out of the basement, and everything would look completely different and horrible. And I just, at some point, I realized I had to get out of the basement and get into a more controlled lighting and working space that I felt more comfortable and could work longer periods of time. And so that was helpful. So a full year of playing around with those ideas and variables so that I felt like I had more control just over the basic materials that I was using to do my work. Um, I'm not guaranteeing that I'll be finished at 9:30 Eastern time, but that's still what I'm shooting for. Um, it's looking pretty good. I don't like there's something off about the measurement and the shape of that grayish area, and it's just too dark in relationship to everything around it. I'm not sure what's off yet. I think I have it over too far to one side, but as I lighten it and shift it over, it should be okay and should read properly. What I'm trying to do is get this top of this form alongside the nose to be pointing upward, and this flattens out here and then comes up as the top of the cheek. Um, Now, some of my brushstrokes are catching the light and reflecting in a way that I makes it harder for me to read the value. And I have to decide whether I want to knock down some of that texture, because that also is going to be part of the finished painting, that as those textures catch light differently than the areas around it, it'll appear like a different value. And sometimes it will be hard to photograph the work, and sometimes it will be hard just to stand in a place where you can read the work really well. So some people use a fan brush to knock those down. Sometimes you can paint in everything in the same direction. That's sort of a John Singer Sargent trick, is that he'll paint all his contour lines in the same, that are on the same form in the same direction, so that they all catch the light in the same way. And and I only know this not from reading about it, but from looking at his work and seeing it in museums and understanding that he's using the brush texture in a certain way to accentuate to help move the eye around the form. He's actually using the grooves of the brush as a tool to force your eye around. And it's a little hard to paint in that way, but he was very intentional about it. You can almost see some of his paintings. It almost looks like grooves in a record working around the form. And sometimes I do a little bit of that, but that's his thing. It's not my thing. Even though it wouldn't be a bad thing to paint more like him, but I don't want to be a copy of John Singer Sargent. I want to paint in a way that feels natural to me, and I think that's important. That more important than getting sort of mastering a particular uh, style or technique in painting is paint in a way that makes sense for how you work. And I'm like to dab and do these small alterations in a certain way. I think John Singer Sargent was working in a way that he was trying to paint in a way that created a sense of efficiency, try to get the most out of each brushstroke in a way that the whole painting was reduced down to as minimal number of changes and moves as possible, and still get the maximum amount of read from those strokes. Okay, so let me see. I have a question from Anne. What is your formal training? This is looking great, by the way. Thank you. And also, you are going to have to do those eyelashes, though. Yes. Um, yes, eventually I will, but there's some paintings where I, in the end, never put in the eyelashes, and they still worked because um, no one knows that if they're just looking at the painting, no one knows the that the reference had these particular type of eyelashes. As long as the painting reads correctly, I mean the eyes itself is reading very nicely. I'm just gonna touch up this right now, the eye right there. Okay, yeah, and a little bit exaggerate the gray. That's the corner of that eye. Yeah. Um, okay. Okay. Yes, that's really helping it move back in space. That little bit of painting what's not there, um, but knowing what will help it read better. Okay. So, so I'm getting this whole circle movement here working. Um, can just do modify that a little bit. So you get that whole idea of movement around the eye, and need to bring in a little more red in here. That's what it's missing, and a lighter. And then I need to go lighter in this hit of highlight. So Anne asked me about formal training. Um, okay, so yes, I'm getting. It's encouraging me to do those lashes. I'll get there eventually. Um, and the smokiness, which is getting some of these dark darks without any whites in them. It's a little bit harder to get, but really a soft edge around the outside. So I'll have to come back in there with another hit of black, I think, and purple. So there is a lot of purple in there. Or alizarin crimson, something. Oops. Did you see that? I just put a smudge where one doesn't go, and I can just clean that up. Okay. Oh, so Anne asked about education. Um, so I did get a formal education. I went to Art Center Pasadena, Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. I initially got an engineering degree, mechanical engineering. At some point decided that I really wasn't an engineer. I wasn't built to be an engineer, even though I'm a natural born kind of problem solver, and that's sort of a lot of the work that I do in web design and web development is looking to solve a very specific types of problems. And in art, I am trying to solve certain types of, trying to understand and solve certain problems in a painting. Um, but like I said, in the end, I didn't think I really was an engineer. I was more creative artist. So I went back to school, got a second bachelor's degree and bachelor's of fine art in illustration. And illustration at that time, that was the degree to take if you really wanted um, those drawing and painting skills. Because if you got a fine art degree in fine art painting or fine art major, there was not as strong an emphasis on the basics of drawing and painting. It was more conceptual fine art. And that may still be the case at a lot of art schools, that there is a focus on conceptual fine art. And so if you want those drawing and painting skills, you may either have to go to an atelier that focuses on drawing and painting, or find an art school that either has an illustration degree or focuses on traditional drawing and painting. If you do want to get that kind of, I hate to call it a traditional traditional drawing and painting skills or formal drawing and painting skills, because there are some places that are more traditional than others. There's the Florence Academy, um, which works very traditionally with their students to have a methodology from how to get from point A to point B in each painting. Oh, I got a brush hair stuck in the paint there. Um, let's get that part of the nose right anyway. A little bit of yellow, orangey, pink. Everything's pink in this part of the face. And then she has the crease in the nose that's very reddish. I'm using just the very tip of the brush, hopefully to get a little bit thinner line, although this is a bigger brush than I would tend to use for this. But I can then carve back some with another color, pink again. And then she has, it's very important, this little touch highlight here, right on the upper flange of that nostril, and it gives such a nice little hint of shininess to that part of the face. The same with the lips. Let's widen that light area, and before I come with a highlight, get a little bit lighter pink. It's going quite cool pink, so I can just add white with quinacridone red and probably get it cool enough right there. And let's see if I can keep that separation of the lips rather thin the way it is in the photo. Okay, both the upper and lower lips are very light, even though, I say traditionally, typically the upper lip will be darker, just because if you have a light source that's above, it will have more light on the lower lip. But I think she has some sort of lip gloss or something that's lightening the the color of the lip. And then I want to keep that hot color in the shadows, so that's going to give me the warm shadow here. I have to almost go pure red there, at least in a couple spots. And then it gradates. You have to be careful with the values if I want to get it to read properly. It's these subtleties that they get the eye to understand the form correctly. And I do have a little bit of greenish purple shadow coming in up here. Something not quite right about the bottom of the nose. I feel like I got about 10 minutes here to finish it up. Am I going to get there? Such suspense. Okay, I want to get that shape of the lip to read, and then she has such a nice highlight at the top of the lip here. I can exaggerate that a little bit without losing anything, and I think, let's see, cut into that a little bit. Yeah, so that gives her a little more sultry, that hit of gloss on the lips, and keep that lightness of the upper lip up here. So I'm going to adjust that. So I could spend hours adjusting the subtlety of values in the face. At some point, I might have diminishing returns, because what I trade off is sort of the freshness of that brushwork. But then I can be super exact and kind of get the fleshiness of those forms. Need to change the color here more drastically. It's too pink. So having this time limit is actually very helpful. Uh, and so she had more of a graphic design, more of a fine art training. They were just adding graphic design in towards the end, if I understood that right. It was not focused overly on conceptual. I did get the hard skills. So, but I think a lot of that has changed over time. I think that if you walk into some of these schools that focus, have a fine art department outside of, and they may have graphic design and printmaking and photography and other things, that you'll find that the fine art degree has become a lot more conceptual in some of these places. And a lot of schools have popped up as sort of um, more like uh, ateliers and fine art only skills, meaning that they're not academic institutions. They're just teaching drawing and painting, and a lot of those have popped up as a to sort of fill the need for what people are looking for. They're just looking to learn how to draw and paint, and these schools no longer are really teaching that. Okay, now some of that's starting to read. I am, let's see. At some point, I'm going to have to step back and see if there's anything that's just killing this whole thing. Some of the things can be left um, unstated or lightly stated. I don't mind that. I think it's good to have some of that in a painting. But I think if there's some areas that are problematic, then it would be good to fix those. Let me just get her nostril shape right. It does cut back faster than what I have it. And excuse my silence. I'm getting kind of trying to concentrate a little bit. Get my brain working. Too dark. Quick. Soften it up. Well, I have to come in just with pure white to knock that back down. That's fine. Okay, well, that nose really is kind of reading is very solid. Except for a little bit of light that's coming in there and a dark edge on the far edge of that that's kind of red with black and purple. Comes out dark right there. And I swear I'm going to get to those eyelashes if it's the last thing that I do. A little bit of gray coming in. This is where I say it's important to have those grays come in because they hold everything together. Soroya would paint in front of his students out on the beaches, and they would assist him and watch very carefully what he was doing. And they would say the painting looked like a great mess. And then he would send them away for about a half hour. And I think he was just using his fingertips and just like smushing everything together and taking out everything that wasn't working in the painting until what was left was everything that was working. But it was sort of this great secret. He would send them away and he would do something. And when they came back, the painting was like almost completely finished. I'm going to cheat a little bit, and even though there isn't a clear highlight on the bridge of the nose there, I'm going to put it in. And I'm going to put in a very cool, almost white highlight here, which is in the photo. It almost looks a little bit too heavy, but then there's kind of a light there. Okay. Have something a little bit off in the drawing, If it's not hurting it, I don't mind, but I don't have enough time to tell, so I'm just going to fix it. Okay. Completely lost her far eye. Let's see if I can just put in a minimal amount of things to get it to read. Oh, that's in the wrong place. So adjust that a little. Let's try it again. There, yep. Paint out the other attempt. And she has just a little bit of orange green that you can see reading right there. I can get it to sit on top of all that black. And then a hint of the lower eyelid. Okay, time has come for me to paint some eyelashes. Just finish up that upper eyelid here and the hair. I want to put in just a little separation in the strands of hair because that'll get all of the hair to read with just that. Okay. Eyelashes. Eyelashes, eyelashes. Okay. Just before I do the eyelashes, I just want just this little indication of the separation of the ear. I think that's going to make a huge difference, and a little bit, no, I'm just going to leave that. Okay. No, I lied. Just want a little a hit of, I'm talking very softly now, sorry. Get that highlight there, a little bit of light that's catching the light. Okay, eyelashes, eyelashes, eyelashes. I think this is for the money. Okay, purple, black, very little white contamination. They don't have to be exact, and I'm trying not to space them so evenly. They just have to have the right feel. They do curl out, which you don't see straight on, but as they get towards the side. Okay, that has about the right amount necessary. Have a one strong one here. And another one. I want to make sure that I start it below where that highlight is. And then these all melt together, one bigger mass at some point here. So this is where I want to come in and make sure I get a dark enough hit along the edge there. And a few smaller ones here, very purple-ish. And still that eye isn't reading quite right over here. Okay. Sorry for the heavy breathing here. Just kind of leaning at a difficult angle here to get the rest of this, and it's actually causing me to be a little short of breath. there is little places like here in the far cheek where you get kind of the light coming through the hair. And if I think it's important to get some of those things in to get this sort of play of light with the bluish. See if I can get it without going too blue. The blue doesn't matter if it's exaggerated a little bit, but don't want it to be funky. Yep, that went a little bit too blue. Okay, just a hit of white there. I am very close to being done. I'm a couple minutes over, and I am just going to wait. I just want another hit of white right here. I think that's going to make the whole thing pop. Yep. Okay. And reinforce the highlight on the nose. Okay. Let me just take one last look. There's a highlight there. Cheek. And okay, now I see a couple things I want to change. How many people are still with me here? 8, I think. Not liking the light underneath the jaw. Feels too sharp and dark, and there's sort of this grayish orange edge to it, and needs the white cutting into it and be a little bit softer against the harder edge of the jawline above it. Actually, this needs a little redrawing here to get the shape of her chin. Very close. I'm very close. I swear. If you guys want to tune out, that's fine. But or I can just take it offline and just do my little last finishes. But it's worth hanging in there for this. Okay, so really want to get the turn of her jaw right. I need more black than purple because I have so much purple in there. She has this kind of orange, very slight, darker color along the edge of her jaw. Okay, getting there. Usually I'll spend a good deal of time working back and forth on this, but if I can get it close and finish it off, I think that's going to be more interesting if I can leave some of that brushwork. Okay, okay, so like I said, I'm close. I think I need a total of 5 minutes to get it. And I run out of white. Okay, just put enough white in so I can do something with it. I just want to make sure that the top part of her forehead is catching a lot more light. That will give an overall sense of turning of her head, which is an important aspect of getting the overall values to work. So if I really pile in the white there, that's going to help that idea. Okay. Uh, pink. Okay. Just feeling like there's a little bit of blotchiness in her cheek. Knock down some of that gorgeous brushwork, but not all of it. Okay. Um, so I think that's it. Okay. So thank you everybody for joining in. This will be reposted soon if you want to take a second look. And I will, pretty sure that I'm going to do this again next Tuesday night and try to make a habit of it. So if you want to come back again on Tuesday, you're welcome to. And thank you. Um, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do and hit the notification bell. Make sure that you get the updates. Thank you.